Howdy, y'all. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 23 today. We're going to be talking about Catholic Orthodoxy. So this week is going to begin a series of 3 weeks in which we're going to look at 3 of the major theological positions, 3 of the major branches of Christianity. We start with Catholicism, kind of just as an update of where they are during this time period to the 16th century going into the 17th and 18th centuries. What issues are they dealing with? What problems have they had? Where are their disagreements? And then we'll do the same thing for the other 2, and that will be Lutheranism and then the Reform movement. So we begin today with Catholicism. When you consider the state of Catholic Orthodoxy at this time, you have to look at the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent had determined Catholic Orthodoxy for the next 4 centuries, so it's a large amount of time going forward. If you don't remember everything about the Council of Trent, you can go back to the episode that discusses it and you can kind of get a refresher. But the Council of Trent did set the pace for where things were in the Catholic Church for the next 400 years. So that's a big deal. However, there were still opponents within the Catholic ranks. Even though the Council of Trent did hold a lot of power, there were still those that didn't like the conclusions that were brought by the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was necessary because the papacy had been unable to respond to the challenges of the Protestant Reformation. So as more and more people were leaving the Catholic Church to join Protestant Reformation groups, the Catholic Church needed to have a response to that. Well, the popes didn't do a great job of responding to that. That's the reason this council had to finally be formed. You can remember when Martin Luther started the whole thing, all he wanted was this universal council. He wanted a council to come in for him to be able to defend himself, explain his positions, and hopefully come to an agreement that would keep them all together, that would do some reform in the area of church doctrine and allow the Catholic Church to remain as one, united. Well, that wasn't going to happen at that point in time. The Catholic Church didn't realize then that they were going to have to deal with this. They thought they could just stamp it down like they always had, and it didn't happen. And eventually the Protestant branch broke off from Catholicism, never to return. But yet the church had to still deal with some things. So that brought about the Council of Trent. The popes went into it looking weak, but that's not how they came out of it. By the end of its sessions, the papacy had gained in prestige and great power over the entire Catholic Church. So again, if you don't remember everything about that, go back and do a little refresher. But the point is that the popes went in looking weak, but came out looking strong. This outcome was not well received in many European courts. Both kings and nationalists opposed the notion of a centralized church under papal authority. So what's going on in and throughout Europe, particularly Western Europe and England, there's a high degree of nationalism. There is a breaking away of a centralized group. The idea of the emperor is out. There's not an emperor anymore. If there is, it's an emperor in name only. There's no centralized government. There are individual states. There are individual countries, and they're very nationalistic. Those rulers want to have power over their areas. They don't want to go back to a system where they're really under somebody else. And so if they don't want to do that politically, they don't want to do it religiously either, because they want to have say in the religious matters of their country. It's such an important part. So they don't like the idea of a centralized church. Nationalists don't like the idea of it. Kings and rulers don't like the idea of it. And they certainly don't like the idea of there being one person, a pope, that has ultimate authority when it comes to religious matters. So they definitely are going to be pushing back against the power of the pope that came out of the Council of Trent. Such attitudes were given the name Gallicanism from the ancient name of France, which was Gaul, because it was in France that they became most powerful. And if you're wondering why what happened in France, where they seem to be pretty staunchly Catholic, we'll get to that in a moment. But there's an opposition group to this. There were those who defended the power of the Pope, and they were called ultramontanes, because they looked for authority beyond the mountains, that is, beyond the Alps. So 2 groups opposing one another, one group that wanted to question the power of the Pope and one who wanted to defend the power of the Pope. What are the reasons that France would have then been in the group that was against the power of the Pope? Well, it's because during the Middle Ages, the French monarchy had obtained a number of concessions from popes. They had a lot of power then. It mostly granted the French church a measure of autonomy. So the French church had so many concessions from the popes that they had a level of autonomy that Catholic Church in other countries did not have, and they don't want to give that up. And so if that meant that they need to push back against what the power of the Pope was coming out of the Council of Trent, then that's what they were going to do. Now the French insisted on those ancient freedoms, which had been negated by the Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent had gotten rid of all that. That wasn't going to be the case anymore, and the French church was saying, well, wait a minute, we didn't agree to that. We want to go back to what we had set in place, and so they're not going to go along with the Council of Trent, and they're going to stand up against the power of the Pope. After protracted negotiations, Henry IV of France agreed to the promulgation of the Council of Trent's decrees. However, the French Parliament blocked him, so the king said, okay, we can't really win this fight. We'll go ahead and go along with this. But the French Parliament said, no, we're not going to go along with it. So he lost on that. By 1615, the decree had still not been promulgated by French civil authorities. So King Henry IV is gone by this point, and his order is still not being fulfilled. But at that time, the French clergy decided they just do it on their own. They'll leave the government out of it, and we'll go along with what the Council of Trent says on our own without any outside influence. In other parts of Europe, similar movements took place, so it wasn't just in France. One such movement, supported by Justin Febronius, argued that the church, as the community of the faithful, should be ruled by their representatives, the bishops. So this was one that wanted to go along with what had been tried. It didn't work, but what had been tried was to just have councils of these upper echelons of church leadership and let everybody have a say in what's going to happen. So kind of a representative form of government in the church. And there were those that wanted to do it that way. They didn't want just the one guy. They wanted to have a lot more say, wanted to have a lot more influence in what was going to go on. Therefore, a council of bishops should have final authority. But Pope Clement XIII condemned this view as heretical, but the idea continued circulating and gaining popularity. Well, it's in Pope Clement XIII's best interest that this idea be condemned as heretical, and so he went right along and did what was in his best interest. Again, we look at this whole time period, corruption in the church, decisions by these popes and bishops and leadership all over the place is going to be very much and very often very influenced by self-interest. And that happens in this case as well. It happens on both sides. It's not just one side. It happens on both sides. Eventually, the French Revolution put an end to such movements. We'll get to that point, but a lot of this stuff in France is going to be dealt with when the French Revolution comes in, because that changes everything in France. So we'll get to that point, but we're not there yet. There's still things going on in France that are going to actually help lead up to the French Revolution in a way. That brings us to another area in which the popes lost power or suffered a power loss, and that was the dissolution of the Jesuits. Their order, founded to serve as an army for the popes, was not well received by the monarchs of the 18th century. So again, you got these monarchs, 1600s, 1700s, and they want nationalism. They want to have full control. They don't want an army, a group that's been known as the army for the Pope, to be active in their country. That's not going to jive with what they're wanting to do, and they want to shut this group down. And in fact, as we're going to see, that's what's going to happen. The Jesuit support of the intolerant policies that led to the 30 Years' War made them unpopular with many, including the House of Bourbon. So people that were fed up with the 30 Years' War, that didn't like it when it started, and certainly didn't like it by the time it ended 30 years later. They didn't like that the Jesuits were on the side that they felt like caused all the bad stuff to happen. So that made them unpopular as well. And then the House of Bourbon was not for them at all. Therefore, as the power of the Bourbons increased, the Jesuits found themselves in greater difficulty. So once again, this group in France, the Bourbons, they were the enemies of the Jesuits, and then as their power goes up, the Jesuits' power is going to go down. In 1758, an attempt to assassinate Joseph I of Portugal was blamed on the Jesuits. A year later, the Society of Jesus was expelled from Portugal, and its property was confiscated. So this group actually got kicked out. And they were accused of this assassination attempt. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. People believed it. And out they went. So they get kicked out of Portugal. In France, the society was suppressed in 1764, and then in 1767 it was expelled from Spain. So these are very Catholic areas. These are not Protestant areas that you might expect them to be against the Catholic Church and their groups, but these are very Catholic areas. France, Portugal, Spain, that's about as Catholic as it gets. And they're all kicking the Jesuits out. That's a huge blow. In 1769, the Bourbon ambassadors in Rome presented to the Pope a joint resolution demanding the dissolution of the Jesuits. So the Bourbons, they have a lot of power now. They've gone to Rome and said, this group, not only do they need to be kicked out, they need to die. They need to be gone, the group itself. So they come in with this idea. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV ordered the Society of Jesus dissolved, thus losing one of the most powerful instruments of papal policy. So this group, known as the Army of the Pope, they're no more. They've been kicked out. They'd already lost a lot of power anyway. They finally got kicked out of main Catholic nations, and then now they're gone. They don't exist anymore. And that's a big blow to the Pope. These events show that the popes were losing power and authority at this time. So even though the Pope came out of the Council of Trent with greater power than the councils, it doesn't mean that they were able to maintain that power or that there weren't issues. So the pushback against the Council of Trent goes on to the extent that the popes, they were propelled into power. Now they're steadily coming back down to earth. And it's happening over a long period of time, but it's definitely happening. So what are some of the theological, doctrinal issues that are going on in Catholic Orthodoxy at this time? We're going to look at the main source of the conflicts here. The Council of Trent had condemned the views of Luther and Calvin on grace and predestination. There were some who feared that in this extreme reaction, there might be a denial of Augustine's teachings. Now, I'm going to take you all the way back to season 1 when we looked at Augustine. He is the most influential figure in Western Christian doctrine other than the Apostle Paul. And some even argue that he is more influential than the Apostle Paul. I wouldn't go that far, but he's definitely very, very influential on Christian doctrine. And people loved his doctrine all through the years. They were big proponents of it, except for this idea of predestination. He was one of the first ones that came up with that idea, that, not to say that nobody else ever had it, but the sovereignty of God, those things, in a lot of ways, people that liked his theology and his doctrines would kind of just, we don't really talk about that one. But over time, that had changed and people had embraced it. Well, these are the very issues that Luther and Calvin jumped on. They were the big issues that they brought in their complaints against the Catholic Church. So now, when the Council of Trent condemned Protestantism and basically defended itself against it and attempted to prove Protestantism to be incorrect, they had to take a hardline stance against these issues because they were two of the main issues. Well, where does that leave you with Augustine? Augustine is a major player when it comes to Catholic doctrine. And there were those who were like, wait a minute, we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. Yeah, you can stand up against the Protestant breakoff, but don't get rid of the things that Augustine taught in order to do it. You don't have to do that. And so there's going to be a conflict as a result of this, and it's going to go on for some time. This led to a series of controversies among Catholics over grace and predestination. We're going to look at several of these. Later in the 16th century, the Jesuits at the University of Salamanca affirmed that predestination was based on God's foreknowledge. So they believed the idea that predestination is not just God electing people, it's that God saw ahead of time who would accept him, and that's who he made the elect to be. It's one of the big arguments when it comes to the idea of predestination, because when you look at it, if there's predestination without any human free will, that's just God picking and choosing who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. And a lot of people don't like that idea. So one way that try to kind of get around this, because predestination is in the scripture, I mean, it is definitely in there, so you can't throw it out completely. Well, some that would be on the side of trying to not go too far in the Calvinist vein would say, okay, there is predestination, but it's based on God. God picks, but he picks those who he knows will say yes. So that's not really true predestination. It takes just as big of a chunk out of the idea of the sovereignty of God. It's just saying people decide on their own anyway. So I don't know why people think that's such a great solution. It's not. It's just saying that people made the decision. God just knew about it in advance. That doesn't really help. But that's the position that the Jesuits at the University of Salamanca took. And there's definitely going to be those that are not going to go along with that. One of the foremost Catholic theologians of the day, Dominican Domingo Banez, responded that such teaching contradicted Augustine and should be condemned. So he said, no, you can't go that way. You can't go with this deal that God's foreknowledge is what allows him to have predestination. It goes against what Augustine taught, and he was right about that. It did. Both sides accused the other before the Spanish Inquisition. The Jesuits declared the Dominicans were Calvinists, and the Dominicans claimed the Jesuits were Pelagians. So again, remember, back to season 1, Pelagius was an early heretic, and he basically said that humans had complete free will. They were in and of themselves good. So it really wasn't a position that the Jesuits were taking at all. And on the other side, the Dominicans were not taking a Calvinist position either. And so both of these accusations are not correct, but they were just throwing insults at each other. Both groups had been condemned as heretics, so they're just saying, well, you're dealing in heresy, both sides. The matter was turned over to Rome, and after long hesitation, the Pope decided that both accusations were false, and for each side to refrain from attacking the other. So in this case, the Pope made a good decision. He said, you're being ridiculous, you're being stupid, stop calling each other these dumb names, stop muddying the issue by using heresy. And we do the same thing today. It's amazing to me how often over the last few years I've heard people being accused if you disagree with somebody, maybe not so much religiously, but definitely in a political sense. I've seen so often, even in a cultural sense, I've seen so often that the name Nazi's been hurled at them. Well, you just get to a ridiculous place with that. There's no conversation to have after that. And if you go back and look at what the Nazis really did, it takes away from the historical reality of how horrible that group was. If you just call somebody that name because you disagree with them, this is really dumb. But this just shows you that's not a new thing. It's been going on for a long time. So the Pope steps in, says this is dumb, stop doing it, and stop attacking the other group. And it helped with this issue, but it doesn't ultimately help. It helps with these groups. It doesn't help with the issue going forward. You'll see that. Michael Bias of the University of Louvain proposed theses similar to those of Augustine, that a sinful will can produce no good, and that therefore only grace can produce repentance and conversion. So he comes along with the Augustine side of things. In 1567, Pope Pius V condemned 79 theses drawn from Bias's writings. Bias recanted but continued to teach very similar doctrine. So the Pope comes against him, but he doesn't shut up about it. Then a Jesuit theologian attacked Bias. The faculty of Louvain responded by declaring that the Jesuit was a Pelagian. So here we go again. The Jesuits are going to be called Pelagians now because they don't agree with this group. And just throw the heretic label on them, and maybe that'll shut them up. The Pope intervened again, trying to calm both sides again, but Bias's theology continued to circulate. So this time it didn't really stamp it down. It kept on going. It resurfaced in 1640 in the work of Cornelius Jansenius. His book, Augustine, published posthumously, claimed to be a study and exposition of the teachings of Augustine on the subjects of grace and predestination. So this is going to stir things up again in the 1600s, almost the middle 1600s. In 1643, Pope Urban VIII condemned the theses of Jansenius, finding them to be too similar to the doctrines of Calvin. So they've got a problem. They've condemned Protestants, but unfortunately, Protestants had based a lot of their theological positions on what Augustine had said. So if you're going to take a hard line tactic of condemning Calvinism and Protestantism, then you've got to almost throw out Augustine, and that's going to just keep on being a big problem. This wasn't handled very well. It was obviously meant to try to stop the bleeding from Protestantism. But in doing so, the Catholic Church created a huge problem for themselves, and it just keeps on going down the road here. But this did not put an end to the controversy. In France, Jansenist teachings were taken up by Jean Duvergy, better known as Saint Cyran, and by the nuns of the Abbey of Port Royal. So Jansenism is going to continue to be taken up by groups as they go because they are going to go along with Augustine and what he taught. The Abbey of Port Royal, under the leadership of Mother Angelique, had become a center for devotion and Reformation. Saint Cyran was also a leader in that movement. So these groups are kind of tied together as they go through this. Saint Cyran was imprisoned for his zeal in Reformation. He was freed in 1643, and at that time he became the champion of Jansenism. By this point, Jansenism became less about a doctrine of grace and predestination and more of a movement of zealous religious reform. And that's what's going to end up happening to Jansenism. It's going to lose what made it unique. It's going to lose the argument that it's trying to make in these different groups that take it up. And at the end of, you'll see, at the end of this, it's just going to become meaningless. But at this point, it's kind of morphed now. It's not just talking about these doctrinal issues. It's also being associated with religious groups in the time that are very zealous in wanting to reform. So Jansenism had nothing to do with doctrinal reformation. It was just going back to Augustine, what the Catholic Church has said that it always taught and believed. But because it did associate itself then with the Protestant Reformation and being aligned with these thoughts that came from Augustine and also ended up being a big part of the Reformation movement, it got associated with the Reform movement that's going on in the Catholic Church at the time. So it's kind of muddying the waters a lot at this point. Saint Cyran died shortly after being freed, but the cause was taken up by Antoine Arnoux, Mother Angelique's brother, and by the philosopher Blaise Pascal. I'm sure you probably heard of Pascal. From an early age, Pascal had shown his genius in physics and mathematics. At age 31, he took up Jansenism. So if you studied Pascal in school, you probably didn't study anything about Jansenism. But this was a brilliant guy, and he is going to weigh in on what's going on with this controversy. Then King Louis XIV, fearful that religious zeal would turn into sectarianism, took action. The Assembly of the Clergy condemned the movement, and the nuns of Port Royal were disbanded. So once again, a guy from the outside gets involved in religious matters. His inclination, his desire is not anything to do with theology. He doesn't care about the theology. He doesn't really have an opinion about it. He just sees a group that he feels like is going to disrupt the unity of his country. And then at that point, that makes it easy for him to decide what side he's on doctrinally. It's the side of the group that he doesn't think is going to mess up the unity of his country. So we just keep seeing examples of this whenever the state goes too far into religious matters or the church goes too far into matters of the state. It just never ends up going very well. Louis XIV asked for the support of Pope Alexander III in fighting Jansenism. Now, that's a big issue because remember, the French side they're against the Pope's power, but in this case, he knows he needs him. So he gets Pope Alexander to come on and help him out. The Pope agreed, ordering all members of the clergy to repudiate Jansenism. So the Pope's ordering his people to go against the doctrinal position that is most representative of the person that was the biggest doctrinal influence in Catholic orthodoxy in all of history, Augustine. It's just insane. It's crazy what's going on right now, but that's what's happening. But then Alexander died. His successor was more lenient, allowing the nuns to return to Port Royal. There was even talk of making Arnoux a cardinal. So things turn. The winds of history blow in different directions, and it'll happen in a moment's notice. So all of a sudden, everything was going one way. Now it's turning on the other. And guess what? It's going to turn again. However, eventually Arnoux was forced into exile where he died. Louis XIV became increasingly intolerant, and Pope Clement XI reiterated the condemnation of Jansenism. So that's taking them back to where they started. They're not in a great place anymore. They're in a bad place now. In 1709, the police took possession of Port Royal and expelled the elderly nuns. The Abbey Cemetery became a place of pilgrimage, so people would come to kind of honor this group, remember them, and the authorities didn't like that. So it was said, this next statement is what was said, so I don't know if it's conclusively been proven, but it's pretty sick. It was said that the cemetery was dug up and that the dogs fought over the disinterred remains. That's gross, but it just shows you what these powers that be will motivate them to action, what they're willing to do in order to maintain their power, even going into to the extent of digging up a cemetery just to keep people from going there. and letting the dogs have their way with the remains. So pretty gross, but something that, if nothing else, at least it was thought that happened at that time. In 1713, Clement XI categorically condemned Jansenism. Jansenism continued its existence, but as a political and intellectual movement against the power of the popes and other dogmatic authority. Eventually, Jansenism disappeared because it had become amorphous. So basically, it didn't have any meaning anymore. It didn't have direction. The doctrinal issues that actually started it, they weren't what the movement really had anything to do with at that point. It had been taken up as a political cause, and it was taken up as an anti-authoritarian cause. And because of that, that doesn't have anything to do with Augustine. It just lost meaning, and it disappeared because it really was of no real use anymore. The purpose in which it was started had gone away. So that's going to bring us to the next movement that's going to come along. Another major controversy in Catholicism revolved around Quietism. The doctrine began with the publication of a spiritual guide written by Miguel de Molinos in 1675. Some lauded it as the highest form of Christian devotion, while others declared it heresy. That's two pretty divergent opinions. Molinos advocated total passivity before God. A believer is simply to die and be lost in God. All activism of the body or the soul must be set aside. So basically, it's the idea of complete and total contemplation to the extent that you don't do anything. You don't try to do right. You don't try to do wrong. You just exist. And your whole existence revolves around the contemplation of who God is and contemplation of God in the spiritual sense, not even in a physical sense. Contemplation must be purely spiritual, having nothing to do with any physical or visible means, including the humanity of Christ. So even Jesus Christ in his physical form, anything that had to do with that was not even worth considering. It's just about the spiritual. So it's going back towards some of those early heresies, especially the Gnostics, and the idea of elevating the spiritual over the material. And that's what this group's going to be about. When the soul is lost in contemplation of the divine, it must consider nothing else, not even the neighbor. So even the ideas of helping your neighbor out doesn't come into play here. They would have looked at that as a negative thing. You shouldn't let your contemplation of God be interrupted even by going out and trying to help somebody. So this is a pretty radical idea, and there's no question that it's going to be controversial because it's not going to go along with historical Christianity whatsoever. Such teaching provoked great opposition. Some declared it more akin to Muslim mysticism than traditional Christian teaching. I don't know much about Muslim mysticism, but I do know that this idea didn't have a whole lot to do with traditional Christian teaching for sure. Others pointed out that Molinism led to privatism, in which the church has no role or authority, and in which Christians have nothing to do with political or social life. So it's just kind of retreating out of life. It's the idea of, the Bible says you're to be in the world but not of the world. Well, in this idea, you're not even in the world, really. You're totally separated from it. You're not salt and light for the world. You're just a private person before God, and everything revolves around yourself and your own contemplation of God. It doesn't have to do with any corporateness at all. So again, it just really doesn't fit into traditional Christianity. At first, the Inquisition supported Molinos, but then rumors of moral laxity among his followers and in Molinos himself began to circulate. These guys weren't worried about any of that stuff. They didn't care about sin. They didn't care about what your body did. They cared about what your mind and your spirit did. The idea here is that not only was it happening, but it was being encouraged. It was also that Molinos' relations with the women in his movement were not above reproach. So there were some ideas of some stuff going on with the women, with the ladies there, that wasn't quite cool at all. In 1685, Molinos and several of his followers were arrested and brought to trial before the Inquisition. Molinos refused to defend himself. Again, he's not concerned about anything that's going on in the material world, so he's not wasting his time defending himself. That's going to take away from his contemplation of God, so he doesn't do it. His followers said he was simply practicing the quietism he preached, and they had a point. His accusers said that his silence proved his guilt, and they had a point too. He was ordered to recant, which he did with great humility. Still, some wanted him to be condemned to death, but Pope Innocent XI had him in prison for the rest of his life. Now, you may be thinking, well, this Pope, maybe he liked him, maybe he was agreeing with him, maybe he was being merciful. No, The Pope didn't want to create a martyr for this group. This guy was actually smarter than a lot of the people that had come before him. And he realized if you go to a zealous religious group and kill its leader, then you've just made that group have a martyr, and that's somebody to rally behind. And so instead of doing that, don't kill him, but just eliminate him. Put him in prison for life. And that's what he did. In prison, he continued his life of quiet contemplation. So this worked out perfectly for Molinos. He was now in prison. He didn't have to worry about any physical stuff. He didn't have to worry about where to sleep, what to eat, anything. It was all done for him. So in one way, maybe it worked out for the best for him. That's easy for me to say, not being in prison. But anyway, he got to do what he wanted to do at that point. That wasn't the end of it, though. Quietism penetrated France. It was taken up by the widowed Madame de Guion and her confessor, Father Lacombe. So these two individuals go along with this idea of this contemplation principle. Around them gathered a circle of believers whom they guided in their religious lives. Eventually, the pair moved to Paris, where their admirers included several members of the highest aristocracy. So started to get some support from the upper echelon of society. That can't hurt. But Madame de Guion's doctrines became extreme. She declared that there may be times when, in order to offer God a true sacrifice, one must commit sins one truly despises. So that's not going to go over very well at all, and it shouldn't. Soon the Archbishop of Paris ordered Father Lacombe be put in prison and Madame de Guion sent to a convent. Well, things worked out better for Madame de Guion than they did for Father Lacombe. Father Lacombe went mad in prison and died. Madame de Guion, however, was eventually freed through the intervention of one of the king's favorites. So she got out of prison and continues to be active and actually becomes a big influence on the next person we're going to talk about. It was then that she won over to her teachings the young bishop Francois Fenelon. Eventually, the issue of quietism degenerated into a bitter controversy between Fenelon and the great French theologian Jacques-Benet Bossuet. And so these two guys are going to lock horns over this, and that's what the quietism is going to boil down to, is a controversy between two people. Finally, under pressure from Louis XIV, Pope Innocent XII rejected some of Fenelon's theses. He carefully declared not that they were wrong, but that they could lead some to error. So the Pope's being really careful because Fenelon is a big influence, and a lot of upper echelon people like him. So he's asked by the king to go against him. So he does, but he does it in a very careful way. He does it by saying, well, he's not really wrong, but if you're not careful, some people could take what he's saying the wrong way, so they need to be careful about it. That's pretty mild, but it's not going to be a mild reaction that comes as a result. Fenelon responded with such humility that the public condemned Bossuet as an arrogant man who had unnecessarily humiliated a worthy colleague. So it doesn't end up going good for Bossuet. He ends up looking like the bad guy who's attacked the poor little innocent, humble guy, and he gets knocked down a few notches because of it. Fenelon then withdrew to his pastoral duties. So he gets out of this controversy. He goes back down. He's kind of been humbled, but he's a humble person, so it's okay. And he gets back to doing what he cares about. He distributed all his possessions to the poor and led such an admirable life that he was the probable model for Victor Hugo's fictitious Monsieur Muriel, a leading figure in Les Miserables. So this guy was such a humble guy and so well known for his love for the poor and for being a self-sacrificing person, giving up everything that he had to help people, that he actually is immortalized in this great work of fiction, one of the great novels of the time and of all time, Victor Hugo's work, Les Miserables. And it's been produced as in book form. Obviously it was written as a book, but it's been a play, it's been a musical, it's been movies. It is a huge influence. And this guy, if you've ever seen it, Monsieur Muriel, he was the influence, was Fenelon for that. So his actually living out a Christian life made a difference. And you go through this, and we've gone through it, and I don't agree with everything that he said. I don't agree with quietism. But he didn't go to the extreme form of quietism. As you see here, he still helped people. He wasn't one that just went away from society and didn't do anything good at all. But you get depressed sometimes looking at this history. You got these people who claim to be Christians that are killing and slaughtering and beating up, imprisoning, torturing, and you look at it and you think, how in the world could there even be any Christianity anymore? How did it survive? And then you see somebody like this, a Fenelon, and there are a lot of people like this. They're not remembered in history, and I think that they will be remembered in the judgment when God does the judgment of Christians, not judgment of whether you go to heaven or hell. That was settled by Christ, but the judgment of what you did with your Christian life. There are going to be a lot of those that were looked at as being great figures in religious history that they're going to be looked at in eternity in a lower sense, because they're not going to have produced actual eternal things. Some of these people that we don't even know their names, that gave up so much to spread the gospel and to love others, they're going to be the ones who have great reward in heaven. And I think somebody like this, it gives you hope, and it helps you to understand that while we look at these historical events, some of the people that weren't living the Christian faith, their stories get put to the forefront, but there are still so many more who were living it out, and they did try to help people, and they did try to live the gospel light. They tried to shine the light of the gospel in their world. And this fellow Francois Fenelon, he was a man like that. And so I'm thankful to get to have one. Doesn't seem like we've had a great guy in a while, but we got one today. So that's good, and it just gives you a little bit of hope for what's coming up in the future, because we're going to have some more rough spots, trust me. All of these events show that during the 17th and 18th centuries, Catholicism was reorganizing itself after the Reformation. The opposition to papal power of the day eventually weakened the Catholic Church and made it more difficult for it to respond to the challenges of the French Revolution. And that'll be coming up in the future. Thanks for taking time with me today. I will remind you that next week we'll continue in this series of emphasis on the three major branches of Christianity at the time. We've done Catholicism. Now we'll move next week to Lutheranism, and then a week after that to the Reform movement. So hope you can join me for those. In the meantime, hope you have a great week, and God bless.